In our last lesson, we talked about how Napoleon Bonaparte played a very important role in spreading nationalistic sentiments as well as the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity throughout Europe. Now we learned that these ideas, the spirit of nationalism, contributed to the outbreak of many revolutions throughout Europe in the 19th century. But before we plunge headlong into a discussion on these revolutions that happened in Europe through the 19th century, it is imperative on our part to look at how the societies were prior to these revolutions. So in this lesson, we will be focusing on society prior to the revolutions in Europe. Now, landed aristocracy was the dominant class in the continent, both socially and politically. So these landed aristocrats were the ones who owned huge amounts of lands, and as a result of this they were also in possession of huge amounts of revenue. So these people yielded power in the society. So in the erstwhile kingdoms and monarchies and empires in Europe, landed aristocracy was in power, and in turn the landed aristocracy also exploited the members of the lower classes of the society, because they had economic power, they had social power. As a result of this, they were also dominant in the political sphere. These landed aristocrats were economically very powerful, and they owned estates in the countryside. So huge estates, manor houses or even town houses were owned by the landed aristocrats. At the same time, they also spoke French for diplomatic purposes. So they were important in the political sphere as well. They held certain important diplomatic relations, which is why they spoke French. And they constituted only a minority of the population. So the majority remained the poorer lot, and it was only a handful of people in the population who had access to wealth, who had access to economic, social as well as political power. Opposed to the minority section of the society that the landed aristocrats comprised, the majority of the population in Europe comprised the peasantry. So as we mentioned, only a handful of people had access to wealth and power, and the majority remained poor. They had to work on the lands which were owned by others. Now there was a division in how the lands were cultivated between the eastern and the western parts of Europe. This is because in Western Europe, lands were cultivated by tenants and small owners, and in Eastern Europe, vast estates were cultivated by serfs. So here we can see a map of Europe, and in the western parts it were the tenants and the small owners who used to cultivate the lands, and in the central and the eastern parts it were the serfs who used to work in the vast estates. Now these serfs were belonging to the lowest rung of the society, and as a result of this, these serfs were treated no better than laborers, treated no better than people who had nothing. So this is how the societies were divided into various classes prior to various revolutions that happened in Europe through the 19th century. Now the Industrial Revolution also led to the creation of new social classes in Europe since the late 18th century. The Industrial Revolution brought about manifold changes in humankind's lives, because the Industrial Revolution now necessitated the growth of new factories, the growth of new industries and machines, and a whole lot of people started working in these industries. These industries and factories were also owned by different sets of people. So there were different classes of people emerging as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Now the Industrial Revolution did not have its impact throughout Europe uniformly and and at the same time. The Industrial Revolution had great impact in England in the 17th century, but by the late 18th century, the impact of the Industrial Revolution reached the eastern part of Europe. So here you can see the differential growth or spread of the Industrial Revolution. Between 1760 to 1840, the impact of the Industrial Revolution was mostly restricted to the western part of Europe, and then slowly through the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, it started spreading to the central and the eastern parts of Europe. And so among the many effects of the Industrial Revolution, one was the formation of new social classes. The Industrial Revolution gave birth to a working class. So this working class comprised people who worked in the factories, in the industries as laborers and workers. Now these working class people did not really have access to wealth. They were quite poor. They had to toil very hard in order to earn a living. And these factories and industries were owned mostly by the wealthy and the propertied class. Now between the working class on the one hand and the propertied wealthy upper class on the other hand, something came into being which later came to be known as the middle class. Now these middle classes came between the working class and the landowning, property owning upper class. Now these middle class members were educated. These middle class members believed that they could bring changes to the society. These people were inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution. These people were educated enough to contemplate or think about their repressed and depressed position in the society. This middle class in fact played a very crucial role in the subsequent decades when various revolutions broke out throughout Europe. The Industrial Revolution gave birth to a working class. Now this working class comprised laborers and workers who worked at the factories and the industries. You should remember that these working class members did not have access to wealth. They were not property owners, and they were mostly the uneducated lot, that section of the society that had to toil a lot in order to earn a living. These working class members were more often than not exploited by the propertied class, those people who owned the factories and the industries. Now, between the working class on the one hand and the propertied upper class on the other hand, came into being the middle classes. Now these middle classes were educated and enlightened. They believed that they could bring about changes in the society because they were the ones who were in the process of bringing progress to the society. These middle class members were not propertied in the truest sense of the term, but all they had to rely upon was their knowledge. They had the awareness of their exploited and depressed position in the society, of how the society was brimful of categorizations and unfair hierarchies. Inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution like liberty, equality and fraternity, inspired by the whole idea of liberalism, the middle class members believed that they could be the harbingers of change, and these ideas of liberalism gained currency among the masses. Now, with their knowledge, these middle class members could actually wage revolutions to overthrow the aristocracy and autocratic rulers in Europe through the 19th century. So, as people who were mostly located in the urban spaces, as people who possessed the knowledge and education to bring about changes in the society, the middle class members played a very crucial role in the outbreak and spread of revolutions which overthrew monarchical rule throughout Europe in the 19th century. Now, a very important point that remains to be discussed is that what does the very word liberalism means? This word liberalism derives from the Latin word liber, which means free. Now, to the middle classes, this concept of liberalism stood for freedom, equality before law, and government by consent. So, liberalism could ensure freedom from any kind of bondage, from any kind of domination, because liberalism entailed a freedom and independence from autocratic rule. And at the same time, liberalism also ensured that all the citizens were treated equally before law. No one was to be discriminated against simply on account of their race or even the class they belonged to. And last but not the least, the most important point about liberalism would be that it means the power to form a government by consent, or it gives people electoral power. Because earlier on in the monarchies, in the kingdoms, people did not really get to choose who ruled them. These emperors, these kingdoms, these monarchs believed that they were ordained by God, and they kept on ruling generation wise, hereditarily. But liberalism now would ensure that people got the power to cast their vote and choose the representatives who were to rule their country. So this is what liberalism meant to the middle class members, and this is the liberalism that they wanted to actualize in the new governmental systems, in the new nation states that they were trying to forge. But it would be wrong to assume that the liberals were successful in bringing about manifold changes throughout Europe in the beginning of the 19th century itself. Because in the beginning of the 19th century, though these liberals, these middle class members who were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, tried to bring about changes, tried to bring about progress in the society, their contributions remained limited. Why is it so? We should know that various kinds of reforms that these liberals were wanting to bring about were not very modern, were not very radical. Now, following the French Revolution, a voting system was introduced in France. Now, this was very modern. This was a step taken forward towards progress, because earlier on the masses did not get to vote. But this new voting system was not universal suffrage. That is to say, not all people got to vote. And in fact, not all men got to vote. Only certain men who owned property got the right to vote. It was only during the Jacobin rule that all French men above a certain age were allowed the right to vote. But during Napoleon's rule, this suffrage of men was once again taken back, and only certain propertied men could vote. So that is to say, the demands and the political reforms which were brought about by the liberals remained quite limited. Those were not very radical in the truest sense of the term. Throughout the 19th and the early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men were not granted their political rights. They were not granted their electoral rights. So, these reforms that were brought about by the liberals were not truly very reformative, were not truly very constructive, because those just took into account only certain men who owned property. But what about the women? What about those men who did not own property? So, these reforms were not free of discriminations and prejudices. These reforms could not abolish the hierarchical system from the societies altogether. Economically speaking, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets to these middle class people. Now, many of these middle class people, on account of their education, were able to gain wealth. And so they wanted to trade freely without any disruptions. They wanted the market to remain open so that various activities could be performed freely. At the same time, they also sought to remove state imposed restrictions on the movement of good and capital, because earlier on the states used to impose various restrictions on the mobility of good as well as capital. But these hindered trade activities, and so the middle classes wanted the removal of state imposed restrictions. In this context, let us now take a brief look at how the German society was, economically speaking, prior to this era of revolutions. Now, when Napoleon was controlling more and more regions, he had formed the German Confederation out of 39 states or principalities. Now, in these 39 states or principalities, there were 39 currencies, weights, measures. So, each of these states had its own currency, weights and measures. It became very difficult for the traders to perform trade activity here. Let me give you an example here. If in 1833 a merchant was travelling from Hamburg to Nuremberg, he had to pass through 11 custom barriers, and in each of these custom barriers he had to pay at least 5% custom duty. So it became so difficult to pay such high custom duties to perform trade activities within the German Confederation itself. Let me give you another example. Because of the absence of a uniform measure system, there were different measures in places like Frankfurt, Mainz, Nuremberg, Freiburg. Now, cloth was measured in a unit called L. 1 L was equal to 54.7 cm in Frankfurt, 55.1 cm in Mainz, 65.6 cm in Nuremberg and 53.5 cm in Freiburg. So can you understand how time consuming this entire calculation system must have been during this time? It was very crucial to have a uniform measure system, a uniform currency. Finally, in the year 1834, a customs union or Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia, and most of these German states of the German Confederation had joined the Zollverein. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. What was the customs union formed in 1834 by the German states known as? Was it known as Deutschland, Zollverein, Third Reich or Volksgest? Well, the correct answer is Zollverein. Now, tariff barriers were abolished after Zollverein was formed. So, it now became easier for these people to continue trade activities within the German states. At the same time, the number of currencies was reduced from over 30 to 2. It was very difficult to have 30 currencies and deal in 30 currencies among these states. And so, the number of currencies was also reduced to 2. So, this now brings us to an end of our discussion on how the European societies were prior to the revolutions. We began this discussion by talking about how the landed aristocracy was in power in the pre-revolution European societies. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, new working classes, new middle classes came into being. And these middle classes were educated, they were enlightened, and they would later on become the face of the subsequent revolutions. We focused on one of the societies, the German society, to be very specific. We saw how initially in the Confederation of Rhine there was no uniform currency, no uniform measure system, and so trade activities or any kind of activity within and among these states became very difficult. Now, having learnt about how the society was prior to the revolutions, in our subsequent lesson, we will be focusing on the political system and the political atmosphere in these European societies just before the outbreak of the revolutions. And we will also learn how that charged political atmosphere actually led to various revolutions in Europe throughout the 19th century. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.